I'm 2 moves into this puzzle, and I've already made 2 mistakes. I sure hope I can turn this around. This is Cryptogram number 5 in the Cryptograms and Coffee newsletter series. In today's puzzle, it's shorter than some of the ones that we've seen this week, and it also can be solved without using 25% of the alphabet. So if that sounds like it should be easy, well, this puzzle has got a couple of tricks up its sleeve. If you start solving puzzles the way that I normally do, working from the smallest letters or smallest words first, you may very well run into the exact same traps that I did. We'll talk about those traps. We'll talk about how I realized that I fell into them and how I recovered. But best of all, I'm going to talk about how we could have avoided them in the first place. So if that sounds interesting, stay with me. So I started solving this puzzle in the way that you've seen me solve many other puzzles so far this week. I've added in the letter S after the apostrophe, and I filled in the letter A into that single word spot. They're the most common choices. But in doing so, I fell into both traps that this puzzle had set. Once I changed the letter Q to be T, things started to look a lot better. I had the in the front row, and the bottom row was looking like that word should be that. And I had one other problem there. I had already used the A. So that meant my single letter word was also wrong. It had to be the letter I. So after changing the letter after the apostrophe to T, I knew I had one other letter figured out too. When a word ends in an apostrophe T, the letter prior to the apostrophe is an N. There's one other really big clue that this puzzle is giving us, and that is the question mark at the end. Somewhere in this puzzle, we have to have one of those 5 question words: who, what, why, when, and how. So we need to figure out where that is. By reading through the sentence that we figured out so far, it kind of makes sense that that question word would be in that 3-letter spot, and that question word would be why. In the second row, the word paint looked like it might be starting to come together, but I wanted to solve this puzzle a little faster, and one way to do that is by looking at the biggest words. And the biggest word in this puzzle happens to be at the very beginning of the second row. So I just talked this through. So what word fits between Y and I? Well, why should I? And then I already had a feeling that the next word was paint. So I filled in paint, and by extension, what am I painting? I'm painting pictures. So at that point, we were kind of into the cascade. Things were really coming together quickly, and we can see that this puzzle has been brought to us by Pablo Picasso. And yeah, I agree, the world doesn't quite make that much sense sometimes, and if you look at his pictures, sometimes they might not make much sense either. I guess that's the way he feels about them anyway. So, what could I have done differently to avoid this problem altogether? Well, the reality is, if you look at the letters and how often they're used, there really isn't all that much of a difference between an S and a T, or between an A and an I. The answer really has to come down from the puzzle overall, and sometimes you're just not going to get it. But this time, had I been more careful, I should have noticed that it's much more likely that the first word of a sentence is going to be the than she. I also should have noticed down in the second row that pattern with the beginning and the ending T's, the word that, is a fairly common pattern, and that is a pretty common word. So it's more likely that I would have the word that in my sentence than some other word like seas, S-E-A-S. That's the only other word I can think of that would really fit that has a beginning and a trailing S. So ultimately it comes down to luck to some extent. Paying attention, though, really helps. If you'd like to know more about letters and how often they're used in English and what that can mean for you, the Cryptograms and Coffee website has a list of all of the letters and their typical usage percentages. So you can see how often a certain letter is used, and you can compare that in relation to other letters. It can be a very helpful thing to do. You don't need to memorize this stuff necessarily, maybe just the top 5 or 6 letters. That would be helpful. And reality is sometimes these types of problems, you can't really avoid them. You just have to be aware of them, and you have to be able to play through them, just like we did here. I'm certainly looking forward to cryptogram number 6 next week.